At 62, Henry Caldwell thought he had finally reached a point in life where surprises no longer had the power to rattle him. He had raised 3 children, buried a wife far too soon, and worked through calloused hands and aching bones to keep hold of the one thing that mattered most: his family's land. The sprawling acres had once been farmland, passed down from his grandfather, Samuel Caldwell, who carved a life out of stubborn soil with sweat and faith. But time had changed everything around Henry. What was once pasture and orchards had been swallowed by a subdivision called Hamilton Ridge, where 156 homes sat in neat little rows, their lawns cut to the same regulation length, their fences painted the same shade of white. The neighborhood stood as a monument to modern order and control, presided over by a homeowners association that had rules for everything, from mailbox height to the shade of mulch residents could use. Henry never joined. His farmhouse, though surrounded by Hamilton Ridge, had never technically been part of it. He had been a ghost at their barbecues, the outsider they tolerated but never embraced. For years, he lived quietly, tending his garden, feeding his chickens, and repairing the same old red barn his grandfather once built. Then came the letter. It was waiting in his mailbox on a gray Tuesday morning, tucked between a coupon flyer and an electric bill. The envelope was stark, stamped with the Hamilton Ridge HOA crest. Henry slid it open at the kitchen table, coffee steaming beside him. At first, he thought it must be some mistake, maybe a notice about a meeting or a misdelivered piece of junk. But then his eyes fell on the bold black words. Notice of violation, immediate eviction demanded. The paper trembled in his hands. His breath caught. He read it again, slower this time. The letter claimed that his home was improperly occupying subdivision land, and demanded that he vacate within 60 days. Failure to comply, it warned, would result in fines, court action, and ultimately, removal by force. Henry felt his jaw tighten. He pressed the letter flat against the table with shaking hands, staring out the window toward the fields his grandfather once plowed. His gaze traveled to the oak tree where his father had hung an old rope swing, the weathered barn with its roof patched a dozen times, the porch where his late wife used to sit and watch the sunset. This wasn't just land. This was memory. Blood. History. And someone wanted to strip it away with a letter. The HOA president, Karen Whitfield, had been circling his property like a hawk for years. She was sharp, ambitious, and ruthless, the kind of woman who smiled in church but whispered lawsuits in the parking lot. Developers had whispered about buying Henry's land for luxury homes. To Karen, forcing Henry out would be her crowning achievement, a chance to prove she could control every inch of Hamilton Ridge. But Karen Whitfield didn't know Samuel Caldwell. A century earlier, Henry's grandfather had seen men like her coming. Samuel had known the land would one day be more valuable than gold, and he had left behind something far stronger than fences or deeds. Something written. Something binding. Something that would, when revealed, shake the very foundations of Hamilton Ridge. Henry folded the letter neatly, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it in the cedar box his father had left him. He didn't yet know how this fight would play out, but one thing was certain. The Caldwells weren't going anywhere. By the end of the week, word had spread like wildfire through Hamilton Ridge. Henry Caldwell was being evicted. Some neighbors whispered it over hedges while watering their rose bushes. Others muttered about it at the community pool or texted gossip in the neighborhood group chat. By Friday night, everyone had picked a side. On one end were the loyalists, those who nodded in approval of Karen Whitfield and her HOA board. Rules are rules, they insisted. If Henry doesn't fall in line, then he has no business living among us. On the other side were the skeptics, families who had always respected Henry's quiet presence. That farm was here long before Hamilton Ridge, they argued at backyard cookouts. You don't just erase a man's history with a piece of paper. The subdivision was split in two, and tempers were rising fast. Henry, meanwhile, stayed quiet. He knew there was no point shouting in the streets or arguing online. He had something stronger than anger. He had Samuel's safeguard. But he also knew the time to reveal it had to be chosen carefully. The HOA board wasted no time turning up the pressure. Karen held an emergency meeting in the Hamilton Ridge clubhouse, where she presented survey maps, bylaws, and contracts, waving them in the air as though they were scripture. This community, she declared to the crowd of homeowners, was built on fairness and order. Every family here agreed to the rules. Mr. Caldwell has enjoyed his exemption long enough. The land he occupies falls under subdivision jurisdiction. If we allow him to ignore the bylaws, we open the floodgates for chaos. Some neighbors applauded. Others frowned uneasy. Then Henry stood. The room went silent. I didn't agree to your rules, he said evenly. And you don't own this land. My grandfather bought it 100 years ago. He saw men like you coming, Mrs. Whitfield. That's why he left behind protections, legal protections. You're not just trespassing on my rights. You're trespassing on my family's bloodline. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Prove it!" Another neighbor whispered, "He's bluffing." Henry didn't flinch. "When the time is right," he said, "I will." A century earlier. That night, alone in his farmhouse, Henry lit a single lamp and unfolded a yellowing document he had retrieved from the cedar box. The paper crackled with age, but the ink was still bold. Across the top, in his grandfather's firm handwriting, were the words, Caldwell Covenant, 1923. It wasn't just a deed. It was a covenant, drafted by Samuel Caldwell and notarized by a county judge. In careful legal language, it declared that the Caldwell land, outlined in precise detail, was exempt from annexation, seizure, or any collective claim by associations or municipalities without direct consent from the Caldwell bloodline. Samuel had been no fool. Born into hardship, he had fought tooth and nail to buy the land in an era when men like him weren't expected to own much of anything. He'd seen how greed could swallow generations. So he had gone to a courthouse one winter's day in 1923 and carved his defiance into law. Henry traced the ink with his fingers, thinking about the man who had planted the same oak trees still standing outside, who had dug the first well that still drew water for his family. Samuel's foresight was more than legal armor. It was a voice reaching across a century, telling Henry to stand firm. The neighborhood erupts. By Sunday morning, Hamilton Ridge had become a battlefield without weapons. Neighbors passed each other on sidewalks with narrowed eyes. Friendships splintered. A shouting match broke out between two families at the community playground. Even the children had begun whispering about Mr. Caldwell and the land fight, parroting what they heard at home. Karen Whitfield, sensing her control slipping, doubled down. She contacted developers in secret, promising that Caldwell's land would soon be available for purchase. She spoke with lawyers, prepared filings, and scheduled an official court hearing. Henry, however, was ready. He appeared calm in the days that followed, mowing his lawn, fixing the sagging porch steps, feeding his hens. But beneath that quiet exterior, he was gathering everything, every deed, every note, every signed covenant his grandfather had left behind. He knew the battle was moving to the courtroom. And in that arena, paper and history would speak louder than Karen Whitfield's smug speeches. By the time the first court summons arrived in Henry's mailbox, Hamilton Ridge was already tearing itself apart. And as the neighbors prepared to watch what they thought would be a simple eviction, they had no idea that the fight ahead would expose not just bylaws and boundaries, but a scandal buried in the very foundation of their subdivision. The courthouse in Simi Valley was packed. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other in weeks sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering nervously. Reporters had even appeared, their cameras waiting for sparks. At the center of it all sat Henry Caldwell, alone but resolute, his weathered hands folded over a worn briefcase. On the opposite bench, Karen Whitfield stood with two attorneys in crisp suits, her eyes sharp and triumphant. She looked like someone who believed the fight was already won. When the judge entered, the room hushed. The case was called Hamilton Ridge Homeowners Association versus Henry Caldwell. Karen's lawyer launched first, striding confidently to the podium. He spoke of bylaws, community standards, maps that had red lines drawn through them. He painted Henry as a stubborn holdout, a man clinging to the past and refusing to accept progress. "This is not about history," the lawyer declared. "It is about order. About fairness. Mr. Caldwell has enjoyed privileges without responsibilities for too long. The association cannot function when one man refuses to comply." Karen nodded along, her lips curling in a satisfied smile. But then it was Henry's turn. Slowly he rose, his boots echoing on the polished floor. His voice carried steady, not with anger, but with the weight of generations. "This is about history," he said. "Because without it, there is no justice." From his briefcase, Henry pulled the yellowing covenant. The room leaned forward. He handed it to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. The old paper seemed almost fragile, yet the words on it were iron. The judge adjusted his glasses, reading aloud. "This land, identified and deeded to Samuel Caldwell, shall remain forever exempt from annexation, seizure, or collective claim by any association, municipality, or entity without the express written consent of Caldwell heirs." The room erupted in gasps. Karen's face paled, her smile vanishing. Her lawyer scrambled, insisting it was outdated, irrelevant, void under modern law. But Henry wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, pulling out a second document. This one newer, signed by county officials less than 20 years earlier, reaffirming the covenant's validity when Hamilton Ridge was being developed. The subdivision had known about it. The developers had seen it. And yet, they had chosen to build Hamilton Ridge around Henry's land, hoping time would bury the truth. But Samuel Caldwell's foresight had been waiting, like a trap set a century ago. The scandal breaks. As the hearing continued, Henry's attorney, called in at the last moment after neighbors raised money to help, revealed emails obtained from a whistleblower. In them, Karen Whitfield and the developers had discussed pressuring Caldwell out, so they could seize his property for luxury homes. It wasn't just arrogance. It was conspiracy. The courtroom buzzed like a hive struck with a stick. Neighbors turned on each other, whispering accusations, pointing fingers. Some of those who had cheered Karen days earlier now looked away, ashamed. The judge banged his gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" But order was gone. By the end of the day, the ruling came clear and strong. The Caldwell covenant was legally binding. The HOA had no claim, no authority, and no future path forward in their scheme. Karen Whitfield slumped in her seat, humiliated. Her lawyers avoided her eyes. And the neighbors who had once treated Henry like an unwanted relic now watched him with something closer to awe. The fallout. The decision tore Hamilton Ridge apart. Families who had sided with Karen questioned how far they'd been misled. Board members resigned one by one. Lawsuits loomed against Karen and the developers for fraud. The subdivision that once prided itself on unity and fairness was suddenly drowning in suspicion and division. But Henry? Henry walked home to his farmhouse, the same land his grandfather had sworn would never be taken. That evening, he sat on the porch beneath the oak tree, watching the sun dip low across the fields. He thought of Samuel Caldwell, the man who had seen the future clearer than anyone else. The farm stood quiet. Chickens clucked in the distance. The barn leaned stubbornly against time. And Henry knew the fight wasn't just about him. It was about every generation that came before, and every one that would follow. The neighbors, whether they admitted it or not, would never forget what had happened. They had tried to evict a man from his legacy. Instead, they had uncovered a truth that shattered their illusion of control. The legacy of defiance. Weeks later, as Hamilton Ridge struggled to pick up the pieces, a local newspaper ran the headline: "Caldwell Covenant Cripples HOA in Landmark Case." Reporters painted Henry as a symbol of quiet defiance, the man who stood alone against an empire of rules and won. Parents told the story to their children as a reminder that history matters. Lawyers studied the covenant as a case that would reshape how property law was seen across the state. And Henry? He didn't care about headlines or legacies. He cared about the soil beneath his boots, the porch where his wife once sat, the swings still dangling from the old oak tree. The land was his. It always had been. And thanks to Samuel Caldwell's foresight, it always would be. Henry leaned back in his chair that evening, listening to the crickets rise in chorus. He had stared down greed, arrogance, and betrayal. He had walked into a courtroom where the odds were stacked against him and walked out the rightful heir of not just land, but of pride. The neighbors might rebuild their fences. The HOA might scramble to regain control. But in Hamilton Ridge, one truth now echoed louder than all the rules in their bylaws. The Caldwells do not bend. The Caldwells do not break. And when the day came that someone else tried to claim what wasn't theirs, they would find Samuel Caldwell's covenant waiting, like a loaded weapon, hidden in plain sight, ready to strike again.